Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that helps you discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is the Director of Education at the Psychedelic Somatic Institute. He's a psychotherapist and former clinical researcher in the MAPS Phase 2 trials of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. He's also one of the primary developers of Psychedelic Somatic Interactional Psychotherapy, or PSIP, a groundbreaking therapeutic modality that addresses mental health issues at the root cause level. His primary work is in training clinicians to provide legal and effective psychedelic therapy in their private practices. Saj Razvi, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I just want to set some context before we start. I'm not a therapist, but I'm really interested in mental health, psychedelics, and therapeutic frameworks and modalities. I ran across your work during a webinar that you gave on psychedelic psychotherapy. And I was particularly struck by some of the videos you showed of clients going through the process, vibrating and shaking as they processed and released trauma. Before we really dive into your therapeutic process, can you share a little bit about your background and maybe some pivotal events that made you want to become a therapist and do the work that you're doing today?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, Artem. I will say that many therapists get into the field because of the old, I guess, cliche at this point, the wounded healer. Certainly that's true of trauma therapists. You don't become a trauma therapist unless you're coming from that in your own background. I can say that when I was going to graduate school, when I interviewed for graduate school in psychology, I basically told my interviewers that I would never want to be a therapist because that seemed like the worst job ever. and somehow they let me in. And I was working for IBM at the time. And, about probably halfway through my first year in graduate school, I looked up and realized that my programming was insane. Things that are totally normalized for you because it's just, the family you grow up in or the water you swim in never get challenged until sort of you get into a place where, it's a mirror being held up to you. And so I realized that, wow, there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. So that's how I came into the field.
Yeah. And I'm curious, what is your personal experiences with psychedelics? I'm making an assumption here, but I'm assuming that you've actually used psychedelics too, before doing this therapeutic work with other people.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to. There's no way that you can go into that very altered state of consciousness without having experienced it yourself. The rules of that universe are so different than the rules of the ordinary state of consciousness. So my history with that is that I didn't have any experience before I joined the MAPS trial. As a researcher, I didn't have experience with MDMA and even very somewhat minimal experience with cannabis, I would say at that point. But I had done a lot of high-end therapy and a lot of my own work. And I was specialized in trauma and I taught it. So that's why I got into that trial. But I will tell you, as part of the initial phases of the MAPS trials, you would go through your own MDMA process. And I will tell you that my experience with that really kind of dwarfed my ordinary state psychotherapy attempts that I had engaged for years prior to that. And I don't want to take away from that. That's a lot of scaffolding that I think we have, but it was just a remarkably deeper, completely different level of work that I had experienced. And since then, we've had teaching, training, and clinic time in Amsterdam. So there has been much opportunity for to work with different medicines. Yeah.
Yeah. So you became a therapist first, and you had all this work with therapy, and then you got introduced to MDMA. That was, I guess, your first psychedelic, or that you used. Have you used other psychedelics? Have you seen a difference in how they compare? Have you only used psychedelics in therapeutic settings? Like, can you give a little more of your experience with using psychedelics?
Yeah, I will say that there's some things that all psychedelics seem to have in common, and then there's things that each one of them has as sort of a unique flavor or a unique gift. The things that they have in common are significant, meaning that if you know of Robin Carhart Harris's work, who was a neuroscientist at Imperial College, one of the things that he's really looking at in terms of conducting brain scans with people who have taken a psychedelic is that there is a organizing network inside the human mind called the default mode network. It's the highest order network that we have, that we can, and it really serves as a organizer or conductor of the other brain regions. And so basically you get this smooth flowing symphony of consciousness, which is given to us by our default mode network. And what psychedelics do is target the receptors that are most heavily found in the default mode network. And so there really is the common thing that all psychedelics do is they degrade the functioning of the default mode network on a temporary basis. And when it does that, you get the arising of a much more primordial, much more primitive animal consciousness that we have, that's based in our sensations, our emotions, our direct experience of the world, rather than a cognitive, abstracted, symbolic experience of the world. And so we know that, the way that psychedelics interact is that they're attracted to the serotonin receptor that's expressed in the default mode network. But the interesting thing is, there's other things that we don't classically define as psychedelics, like cannabis, that absolutely does something quite similar in terms of degrading our ordinary cognitive mind and giving us much more direct experience to body. So in that way, they are quite similar, and I would say the ways that particularly cannabis and something like MDMA are unique is that they are so body oriented. They really sort of give people a very sensate experience of body, as opposed to, more transpersonal experiences that you would have on the classic tryptamines. Yeah. Is there more to that question that I left out, or please do feel free to.
Yeah. You gave kind of more of an overview of how psychedelics work, and with the default mode network, and that's very fascinating. And all of like Robin Carhart's work really helped me kind of map my own experiences of like understanding what's going on, and like, yeah, the ego is actually like, to me, the default mode network is like, that's the ego. You call that the orchestra, the conductor. That's regulating everything, and that kind of starts to fall away, and then everything opens up. But I am curious, like, what your experiences were actually with, if there was other specific psychedelics, how they were different, how maybe the healing that you experienced there was different from, you've already done a lot of psychotherapy before, you said. So now, I'm not sure what age you are, but you've already have experience. You're already an experienced, seasoned therapist, and now you're starting to use these medicines. And like, what is your experience? I kind of want a little more of that, if you can share.
Yeah. You mean my personal experience?
Yeah. That's what I'm curious about. They say that the personal is what's most universal, so that's what I try to touch on.
That's what you go for. Okay. Well, I will say that I think my system is somewhat unique, and in terms of how I approach psychedelics. And what I mean by that is the type of psychotherapy I had done for years prior to entering the world of psychedelics was a very body somatic oriented form of psychotherapy. So really, it wasn't about insight. It wasn't about telling the story. It wasn't about cognition at all. It wasn't about belief systems, really. It was just about sort of this bottom-up change that happens when we engage our nervous system process. So it's a very felt sense form of therapy. And I'll say that when I went into the world of psychedelics, I had that pathway very well developed in my system. So, and the difference that I'm pointing to is that, a person can take a psychedelic and they can spend the entire time talking their way through a psychedelic. They could have insights, they could have more awareness, which is, fantastic. A psychedelic will absolutely amplify the depth of how, your self-awareness can go. But that's not the pathway that psychedelics took in my system. They pretty much really just took that nervous system pathway and just amplified sensation, amplified, how available the traumas in my life were to me. I could sense and feel things that I would never have been able to without the psychedelic on board. So I think that's a somewhat unique pathway through it. Many people who go into the world of psychedelics probably are looking for a more transpersonal experience. They're looking to go to God. They're looking for unity consciousness. And oftentimes I think people can achieve that in a disembodied way. And so I think the pathway my system took, and I think what we recommend at our training is to go in through sort of our biology and then sort of build up from there until we get to transpersonal.
Yeah, those are very interesting points. And I think that kind of resonates with my own experience, because I don't think that my somatic, like embodied pathway was built out. I think it's something that's only now I'm starting to really work with. And I think because of that, it was kind of difficult to ground some of the psychedelic experiences I have that were really, really out there. And then coming back, and it's like, how do I integrate? How do I ground it? That's like the difficult thing. And I actually think that that's one of the biggest kind of problems that is happening right now in like the psychedelic fields, and like everybody using and experimenting with psychedelics. And it seems like the pathway you're doing, in a way, it's, I want to say, the most healthy and the most safe, and it's like most likely to integrate and to it's like, also to me, it's like relational, because the thing with how we move around in the world is very relational, and to be able to relate in a healthy way, you have to be embodied. And so that's kind of how I see what you're saying with your approach to it.
Yeah, that's huge. And I would agree with your assessment of what's happening in the psychedelic fields right now. And yeah, it's almost like saying, if people are approaching the psychedelics because of their own wounding, meaning that they're suffering at some level, they have anxiety, they have panic, they have depression, they have depersonalization, they're just kind of feeling numb in the world, those kinds of things, then, I would suggest that most of our wounding is caused by human relationship, right? Basically, these are things that have happened to us in childhood, and human relational wounding requires human relational healing, right? So, in other words, as wonderful and powerful as the transpersonal experience can be, I think there's work to be done at the level of our humanness, at the level of our relationships, right? And the point you made in terms of, if people don't do that, then I think there really is an issue with integration. It's like wonderful to see this transpersonal reality, the revelations that happen for people in that space. It's much harder to integrate those back into your life when your core programming is telling you very different things about the world and relationship, right? So I guess a way to describe that is, we find people with trauma have a lot of dissociation, not just when the trauma happened, but ongoingly, they have a lot of dissociation. So if you take somebody whose mind is, creating this dissociative defense to protect them against the traumatic memories of their past, and that person then attempts to go into a transpersonal space, they're going in there with a lot of dissociation intact, right? So there's sort of a lot of things that I think could be super helpful to have on board when you go into transpersonal space that we don't have on board if we're going in with trauma and if we're going in without body.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's almost like you come into that state, and if you're dissociated in that state, it's almost like the experience doesn't penetrate deeply enough to transform you. So you have this incredible experience, and then you come out of it, and it just kind of slowly fades away and doesn't really stick.
That's it. That's exactly it. Yeah. Your system is so entrenched in a very different reality, a traumatic reality, a reality of neglect or abuse or abandonment. That lives in your tissue, right? That lives in the body, and that's not going to go away because you had a glimpse into, sort of the loving universe that we all live in.
Yeah. This part of the conversation is so important because I really, I interact with a lot of people in the psychedelic spaces, and I watch people, and there's a lot of people that have had a lot of experiences, and with ayahuasca, 5-MeO DMT, which in my experience is, I think, the most powerful psychedelic. And you see them having these kind of spiritual experiences, and then still kind of going through suffering, still returning to these things many times. And it's almost like they keep trying to come back to that space because something is not resolved, something is not okay in the system. The system is craving for something is not right. So it's almost like this is what's being missed, I think, in the psychedelic field, is like, this is like, it's almost like, obviously psychedelics allow you to have these spiritual experiences, they allow you to have these transpersonal experiences, but it's almost like we should first start with this very basic healing part, because it seems like from that we can grow and develop in the least pathological way and stabilize. And maybe people don't really need to do psychedelics as much as they're doing them. Maybe a couple of times is all that's really needed if it's done properly.
Yeah, ironically, I think that's true. I've heard a master of the Iboga tradition say that medicine is something that people should only do maybe once in a lifetime. So I think you're right. And I love how you put it, that something is being missed. And that's why, we have this compulsion to keep coming back to the well, because it's not landing. It's not, it doesn't have a place to sort of really take hold inside of us. I would agree. The one other way of looking at this is that, look, we have this incarnate reality that we're born into. Sort of, why not love the hell out of it while we're here? Why not sort of have this experience of body and ego in the healthiest possible way we can, as opposed to demonizing the ego and trying to transcend it? Right. So, yeah, I agree that ego is fantastically problematic when it's just identified as our waking, ordinary consciousness, rational mind. But I think it's possible to have an ego that is deeply informed by the unconscious process of being alive, deeply informed by sort of the experience and information that we hold in our bodies.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is like, that's what embodiment is. That's what I think it means to be embodied. So, I mean, you've mentioned a little bit, but maybe you can speak a little bit more. What are kind of the limits of talk therapy, and like, how does the psychedelic psychotherapy overcome them? Like, what are the major differences? What are some of the modalities that are kind of really popular now in traditional talk therapy, but they're kind of limited in what they're able to do?
Yeah, great question. So some of your listeners will probably know Bessel van der Kolk. He is a traumatologist, really well-known researcher in the field, and has done a lot of great research. And one of the things that has come about through his work is that he is saying that, like, look, when the human organism, when the mind is experiencing highly stressful or overwhelming experiences, our ability to remember really goes offline. Our ability to sort of track and remember things that have happened to us really becomes degraded. And what he's referring to there is what's called declarative memory, meaning the type of memory that you have conscious access to and you can put into language. Right. And however, he notes that there's all sorts of non-declarative memory processes, meaning that memory that lives in a very different way in our system, like lives as an experience in our system rather than as language. And his research is saying that those memory systems are alive and well and recording quite well when we're experiencing stress and overwhelm. So this is ironic, right? I mean, sort of one of the most significant researchers in the field of traumatology is saying, like, look, your language capacity and your access to memory really goes away in stress and trauma. And yet all of the modalities that we have in terms of Western psychotherapy are language-based. They're declarative forms of therapy. They're designed to have us have more insight, more awareness of what's going on in our systems, work with our belief systems, things like that. And when in fact, the reality of what has happened to us and where it lives inside of us is not language-based at all. Right. So I think that's part of it. The other part is just like an experience that I think most of us have had. If you've done therapy for any significant amount of time, I think it's something that's really interesting to the mind to have more insight and awareness of what's going on. But I don't find that insight and awareness changes our reactivity all that much. I don't find that, the patterns in us that have been there since childhood change all that much when we have more insight into where they're coming from. I find that, modalities that are much more experience focused, which allow us to really sort of contact and feel the depression, contact and feel the anxiety, I think that takes us much further because, we're much closer to what happened.
Yeah. And I think you're talking about like implicit memory, and this whole notion of implicit memory is actually, it's fascinating. It's like the way I understand implicit memory is you're in an experience and something triggers an implicit memory, but you're completely unaware of it. You're not, and then you you get very reactive and you don't know that this memory is being triggered. You're completely unaware of it. And it's actually, you can see it in other people. It's pretty easy to see it in other people. It's hard to see it in yourself, but it's a kind of a pretty scary thing that there is such thing as implicit memory and how it works.
Yeah, it's both a scary thing and it's a wonderful thing. I think it's scary for our conscious minds that think that we're in control. If you wanna like think about that, the Freud's topographical map of the mind, right? Which is he's got 10% of the iceberg, which is available to be seen. It's our conscious, rational mind, but 90% of the iceberg is under the surface of consciousness, right? It's invisible to us. And so much of who we are, how we operate in the world, how we operate with people, whether we can trust people in relationship or whether we get paranoid, all of that programming is in the 90% of the iceberg that's not visible to us. So, I mean, for me, I think that's actually a fantastic aspect of how we're built, right? That we go much deeper than our consciousness. But I can see how that would be scary as well.
Yeah. From that perspective, from the perspective of understanding and controlling, and from that perspective, it definitely is scary. So I think this is a good time to kind of go a little bit more into your model and your therapeutic approach, which you call Psychedelic Somatic Interactional Psychotherapy, or for short, PSIP. Like, what was the process of developing it, and maybe some of the other therapeutic frameworks that you built off of?
Yeah. So initially, PSIP was not a psychedelic modality specifically. I had trained in it in 2003 and became one of the instructors in it by 2008. And it was specifically a trauma modality that was really focused on sort of entering in through the body. So something I think most people will have experience with is that, psychedelics are not the only way to get to our unconscious minds, right? Psychedelics are not the only way to get to non-ordinary states of consciousness. We can do it through meditation. We could do it through fasting, dance, chanting. There's all sorts of different pathways that take us there. And I will say the body absolutely is one of those pathways that when we would do this work without medicine on board, people would go into altered states when they would encounter sort of, programming and again, that implicit layer of memory. And while that would happen, they still have their ordinary consciousness on board. So oftentimes ordinary consciousness serves as a sensor mechanism or, puts on the brakes if things got a little too intense or scary for somebody. Which is easy enough to do if we're living a life where we're trying to preserve our functioning and preserve our ego structure. The beauty of what psychedelics do in that same somatic process is they just take us so much more deeply into non-ordinary states of consciousness that it's much easier for the body process to take place in that realm. We discovered it. So I'll just say that, let me see. Yeah, this is something I feel like I can say. I referred 3 of my patients into the MDMA trial that I was a part of. So these are all 3 of these people were people that, again, had that somatic pathway very well developed in their system before they went into the psychedelic world. And in the phase 2 trial that I was a part of, they had, it was a double-blind study, so nobody knew what people were taking. There was either a full dose of MDMA, which was 125 milligram dose, or in this case, what was considered the placebo or the closest thing to a placebo, which is called a comparator dose, because it's pretty obvious when you're not on MDMA. And so the comparator dose that MAPS found was 40 milligrams of MDMA. And they picked that because they said, this is a dose where people will feel something, but they shouldn't be able to do any kind of meaningful therapeutic work on 40 milligrams of MDMA. I will tell you that, so 2 of my people that I referred into the trial got the comparator dose, unbeknownst to them or me, and they went to town on 40 milligrams of MDMA, right? So again, what we're talking about is a body process and interventions that are part of the body that pair beautifully with non-ordinary states of consciousness, because I think fundamentally the body is its own non-ordinary state of consciousness. So is that kind of help? Yeah.
Yeah. I guess, well, you said that you trained in this modality because from my understanding, you're one of the primary developers of what you call PSIP. So I'm curious, what was the modality before? What was it? Was it like a somatic experience, or what was it that came before you called it PSIP or like built on it? Yeah.
Yeah. So this was back in the early to mid 2000s. This was called trauma dynamics. And it was a non-psychedelic oriented modality. We had a lot more interventions and protocols for working with trauma without these medicines. And so I would say so first of all, let me just acknowledge we are standing on the shoulder of giants, right? There are people that have come before us that have done a lot of work in terms of developing aspects of somatic psychology that were built, like Eugene Gendling's work with focusing. Yeah, he's sort of the father of one of the fathers of somatic therapy, and just like that whole technique of focusing in on an interoceptive, proprioceptive information really is, I would say, common to all somatic modalities that are out there, whether it's somatic experiencing or Pat Ogden's work. They're all using that focusing technology as a core of what's going on. So, and we do as well, right? We absolutely do that. And I think the difference of how we're working with things is that, we found that the somatic process is greatly amplified, accelerated, made more accessible to us through the neurological shift that psychedelics create in a person's system. So, when I got into the MAPS trial in 2014, I thought it was amazing. But I thought this was a unique property of MDMA. And so I was like, oh, okay, this is great, but we have to wait till 2021, 2022 and further now, it looks like. But then Colorado being a cannabis legal state, we had our clients come in and tell us that, that type of processing that my body goes into while I'm in therapy, if I go home and use cannabis just for fun or just to try and go to sleep, my body goes into the exact same process. And to tell you the truth, Artem, we did not believe them. We were like, there's no way. Everybody knows cannabis. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Nobody talks about its therapeutic use. And then we invited them to bring their cannabis into therapy with them. And sure enough, it did exactly that. Then this really caused us to kind of recalibrate and say, like, okay, there's something bigger going on here than just, something unique that MDMA can do. And so, I think we discern that, there's these biological processes that we're engaging with the modality. And then, the psychedelic helps us get there much more easily. And that psychedelic could be cannabis, it could be ketamine, it could be psilocybin, it could be MDMA, it could be all sorts of things that really do help us get there.
Yeah, it makes me think of actually, I had a friend who recently used 5-MeO DMT and, had a profound experience. And then he would always smoke cannabis. And now he would start smoking cannabis, and he was like, I can't smoke anymore. Cause like every time I smoke, he's like, I get into these deep states and like I have all this like material coming up, and it's almost like that experience somehow cracked it open for him. But this, I am curious about this, distinction with what substances you use. And from my understanding in your work, you're mostly using cannabis and ketamine. And you already touched on that a little bit of like why you do that, but maybe you could speak a little bit more of how, how cannabis and ketamine, why they're more effective or how they're different than the classic psychedelics of psilocybin, LSD, and like mescaline. Just like the more, it seems like they've been doing a lot of research with psilocybin for resolving anxiety, depression, these kind of things. I don't know if I'm familiar with seeing stuff with cannabis, like them actually doing research like that, but it does seem like you're focusing on cannabis and ketamine. So like what are the differences just in your experience of how you did mention the transpersonal and the embodied thing, but maybe you could speak a little bit more on that, because I think it's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's start with cannabis, because that's typically what people start with in our trainings. And in fact, let me give you a little story about that, and then go into the details of it. When we were doing clinical work in Amsterdam, we would have people fly out from the U.S. and come to us and do, wanting to do psilocybin work. And some of those folks were complete non-responders to psilocybin, and regardless of what dose they took, complete non-responders. And I don't think, this made me really curious. So I interviewed a number of other therapists in the Netherlands, and including one of the researchers at Imperial College in their study of psilocybin, and they were nodding their heads. They found exactly the same thing. I don't know what percentage of people it is. 25, 30%, something like that, I would guess. But, there definitely is a population that psychedelics do nothing for them. And so, I'll just say our sort of working theory that seems to be holding up at this point is that we're looking at people that have a lot of dissociation in their system. And psilocybin is a much more advanced psychedelic, and it's not working at the level that people need work. And so what we started doing is for people that would come out and have a non-experience with psilocybin, we would say, well, you have to wait a few days anyway before your next round. How about trying cannabis psychotherapy? And they would absolutely have an experience with the cannabis work. And so even them doing 3 cannabis sessions prior to the next psilocybin session really changed the nature of their second psilocybin session. There was more ground for that medicine to take hold in a person's system. So we started doing that with everybody. Anybody that would come to us, we'd say 3 cannabis-assisted psychotherapy sessions first, and then moving on to the classic tryptamines if they wanted to. So this is really getting at, I think, a really unique and wonderful property of cannabis, which is that more so than any other psychedelic that I've ever seen, it is effective at resolving dissociation. And in fact, I'll say something that to you that about a research paper that is soon to be published. But using the PSIP work and cannabis, it's actually a case study of a client that had post-traumatic stress disorder with the dissociative subtype, meaning that there was a lot of numbing, avoidance behaviors and things like that in this person's system. And they went through 10 sessions of cannabis-assisted psychotherapy with PSIP, which, on the last anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours at the most. And they had a 98% reduction in their dissociative symptoms, which is amazing, And so again, it's a case study, and we're doing more of that. But that's I think giving us a little window into the value that cannabis has in a person's psychedelic journey, which is, again, so many people that have trauma from childhood will absolutely have dissociation from that trauma operating in their lives to this day. And so I think that's the type of person that, psychedelics don't do a whole lot for necessarily. And so starting with something like cannabis to really break that up, and then moving to a ketamine, if you wanted to, could be super useful. Cannabis also really helps, again, I've not seen anything like it that really gets people in touch with their body, right? Their executive functioning is gone. Their ability to tell stories, their ability to reason to think properly, totally out the window, which is why traditional mental health hates cannabis. They think it's just like vodka. How's it any different? And, but if you have a therapy that doesn't value insight and storytelling nearly as much as it values direct contact with experience, then cannabis is a wonderful medicine for that type of therapy.
Yeah. It's very useful. And it's interesting that you're saying that cannabis doesn't make people dissociate like psychedelics. And I actually want to talk a little bit about ketamine, but I want to run this past you. This is something I read. I don't know if it's true, but it's interesting theory that something like mushrooms, that somebody ingests psilocybin mushrooms, there is a theory that for some people it may not work because of some bacteria in their stomach or how they process and digest it. I am super curious if somebody that does take the mushrooms and doesn't have that effect, how it would be intravenously, since it would bypass. And also with something like DMT, it's also different. It's a different mechanism of how it gets delivered into the body. So that's just something I'm curious about. I have no clue. It's very interesting what you're saying, because I know several, I have a friend who's taking psilocybin, big doses, and it doesn't seem to really affect him. Something seems to be happening, but then afterwards it's well, where did you go? What happened? It was nothing really happened. For me, I can take a much smaller dose and it's mind blowing. It's insane. So it is interesting that there might be something like this happening, this dissociation, and that's not happening with the cannabis. Now, I do want to kind of explore ketamine, because ketamine almost seems paradoxical from what my understanding, because ketamine isn't ketamine, it's a dissociative, isn't that's what it's been known. So can you kind of speak on what happens there? What is happening when somebody with trauma takes ketamine, and how is it actually able to integrate? Because if it is a dissociative, can you kind of speak on that paradox of ketamine?
Yeah, let's speak to that first. And if people don't know, ketamine is a drug it's been around since the 70s, is incredibly well researched by the anesthesiology community of doctors. And it's an extremely safe anesthetic. It won't shut down your central processing, nervous system processing, meaning that nobody will stop breathing on ketamine. It has other complications with it, which means that it really should be done in a much more like controlled way. But it's much safer than other anesthetic drugs. I'll put it that way. They use it in pediatric settings in hospitals because it is so mild in a way. And used in much lower doses than they use for anesthesia, people are still awake. You can interact with them, and they're absolutely having a pretty profound psychedelic experience. I would say very much more similar to something like psilocybin, much more similar to a classic tryptamine experience than something like MDMA or cannabis. And even with that, there's some significant differences. Like I think most people find that with plant medicines, they sense a spirit about the medicine that they've taken. I think many people experience ketamine as cold. It's synthetic. It doesn't seem to have that spirit to it. But that's where I think the relationship and with the therapist comes into play, because I think it is our humanness that could really warm up that psychedelic experience. But the uses of it are pretty remarkable, I would say. It's the research around it has a lot to do with ketamine as a antidepressant. And that's, if you encounter a ketamine infusion center, that's how they're using it. There's no process that happens there. They put you in a darkened room and you're alone, and maybe every 20 minutes a nurse will check on you. So there's no real psychedelic process that emerges and gets engaged with in that setting, which is fine because people are looking for just an antidepressant. If used in psychotherapy, which a lot of people are doing these days, they get a prescription for oral ketamine, sublingual ketamine.
I'm curious about that. Yeah, because I've been seeing that a lot. I know there's a company, Mind Bloom, so I've been reading a little bit about it, but I'm just curious, like, what, from your understanding, what that process is like and how that's different than your process or similar.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, again, you can do a lot of different things with people in a psychedelic state. You can just do the sitter model with them, which is just kind of hold space, not be very interactive. The magic in that model is, the interaction between the client, between the participant and the psychedelic. Or you could use ketamine in a much more interactive way, which we support our clinicians doing. So here's where I'm coming from on that. Ketamine softens people in a really dramatic way. Like, all the armoring that people can typically walk around with that, prevents them from being relational or prevents them from being vulnerable. All of that just kind of falls away with ketamine. And what you get in the middle of this ketamine experience is sort of a wide-eyed child looking at you. And so if the therapist, knowing that, the therapist can really step in and start generating these very corrective, emotional, relational interjects that kind of get put in very deeply at the programming level for a client. The very, very nurturing parental roles, things like that. And, an example of what this could look like is a therapist could, for somebody that's just maybe really incredibly self-aggressive or judgmental of themselves, a therapist in a ketamine state, a therapist could say something like, oh, I'm really here with you and you're so worthy of love, and then this person who would just, deny this all day long in their ordinary state of consciousness, under ketamine, they could really look at you and say, do you really mean that? Am I really good? And it's just this really soft, tender place that opens up inside of people. And so we can use that early in psychotherapy to really establish a foundation for people that just didn't get it in their childhood. And once that's done, further on in the psychotherapy process, ketamine can be used as a processing agent as well. You can use it to really, process trauma in ways that you can't do with cannabis, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, and what is that difference with ketamine, like how it works than cannabis, that it allows? So what? So they are processing when you are using the cannabis, they are processing trauma also. So what is the distinction you're making here of further processing, or what is the distinction you're making of what you can do with ketamine that you can't do with cannabis?
Yeah, I think cannabis gives you sort of almost like a myopic view of what's going on. Like you're right up against what's going on because you're just feeling it in every cell of your body, right? You're feeling it in every muscle fiber. With ketamine, you're not up against it like that. You've got some like space from it. You got distance from it. You're getting a much bigger picture of the patterns that went on, and you're able to engage it at a much bigger level. So here's an example of this. And I think this is similar to how psilocybin works, right? So if somebody had a lot of neglect or abandonment in their childhood, right? With cannabis, you're going to feel that neglect and you're going to feel these waves of terror and activation around that neglect. Your mind is not going to know what this is. You're just going to be feeling things in the cannabis space. Whereas in the ketamine space, that neglect can take on a very metaphoric imagery form, right? It could become like you see a dead world in front of you. You see a forest that has no life in it whatsoever. And you just feel that as a mood. You feel that as an emotion, like you're seeing the deadness of this world. And fortunately, again, if you have already used cannabis to develop that nervous system process, that will also show up in the ketamine experience. Right. So you'll see this dead world, and then your body will begin to process the heartbreak, the incredible sadness around, this dead world that you grew up in. And one other way I think to say, describe all of this is that, when I'm having a cannabis experience, or the experience that I've had with MDMA, there's always a part of my mind that's standing apart from the experience, kind of witnessing it, knowing what it's doing, and separate and apart from it, right? But with something like ketamine or psilocybin, there is nothing in me that's standing outside of that experience. So when I'm in that dead forest, I am experiencing that dead world, and it could be really powerful in that way. I would say it's a more full spectrum psychedelic than cannabis is. But again, I would want that nervous system pathway online for me as I experience the dead world that ketamine could bring to us.
Okay, so let me see if I'm understanding kind of how you're framing the differences between cannabis, ketamine, and say something like psilocybin. It almost seems like they kind of build on each other, and you start with the cannabis, and then you potentially go to the ketamine, and then potentially go to the psilocybin. And cannabis and people seem to be more receptive in an embodied way to cannabis and ketamine. And then psilocybin is like, once you have those pathways built out, it's safer to kind of go in there and then have that more transpersonal, let's say like spiritual experience, which is already kind of going beyond the realm of where you're trying to work, because you're trying to work within the therapeutic model, really resolving trauma. So is my understanding of how you're perceiving these accurate, or is there anything you would add or change with what I said?
Yeah, thank you for that. And because I would alter it a little bit. I think that ketamine is pretty similar to what psilocybin can do for people in terms of a psychedelic experience. Again, I think you could completely have transpersonal experiences with ketamine. You could have very embodied experiences with ketamine, just like with psilocybin. If you take a low dose of psilocybin, like a 1 gram dose or thereabouts, you can have a very powerful embodied human experience with psilocybin. You're not going to like shoot up into transpersonal space. And in fact, some of the people that I've heard talk about this, who are really well experienced psychonauts, said that of all the medicines that they've worked with, some of the most difficult journeys that they've had were low dose psilocybin. and I think it's precisely because of that. It's like, you got the psychedelic effect, but you're not leaving the human realm. You're staying in there. So you're feeling your trauma with it. So Yeah, so I think cannabis to begin with, and then either ketamine or psilocybin if you wanted to move up from the cannabis.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I'm also really interested now in the actual training that you do and that process. Like, how does that work? Who is the training for? How would somebody get into this? And yeah, just maybe you could share a little bit about that. It's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do a training for mental health professionals and people with maybe a significant background in the healing arts, meaning that they've trained in a psychotherapy modality. Maybe they didn't go to graduate school, but they've trained in a sort of a good developmental therapy modality, and they know some things about trauma, and they have experience really holding people's process when the shit hits the fan, right? And so that population is who we allow into this training. Specifically because we're not going for transpersonal experiences. We're going for really, psychedelic human level wounding. And so the process looks very different than, the sitter model. It's much more interactive. There's a lot more projection. There's a lot more negative transference that clients will have towards the therapist, which is, these are very intense energies to hold. So we want people that have that kind of a background. Now, the other thing that I think is unique about our trainings is that they're only 3 people big. And
Wow.
they're only, yeah. So, this is very different. We used to run trainings that were still pretty small, like 12 to 16 students. But even at that rate, we found that the best way to learn how to work with psychedelic medicine is to engage in your own process with it, to really feel it from the inside out. This is not something that you can communicate through a lecture format to another person's mind. I mean, even people listening to this, I think if they've not had the experience that we're talking about, it'll be a very different experience once you actually go in, right? And so we found in our, 12 to 16 person trainings that the students that hung out after the training and wanted to get some additional session work from me, we found that their intuitive grasp of the material was far deeper than the people who didn't do that. So knowing that, we just completely scrapped our 12 to 16 person trainings, and we have what we call the psychedelic apprentice training, which is, again, 3 students to 1 PSI faculty. And we have them for a period of 5 days. And every single day they're going in either with medicine or they're doing some integration work around their medicine experiences. And really they're learning from watching the other 2 people in the cohort. And then they're learning from their own experience doing it. Which is all to say, Artem, that, I mean, God, if there's anything on this planet that is truly an art form, it is psychedelic therapy, right? It's like, it is something that will take time and personal process, and it should take time for people to get good at this. This is not something that, you can do a weekend workshop at and come out and really know your way around this world.
Yeah. I'm just having this question that's popping up. I wonder if you would take an ayahuasca shaman for a training like this. That's just what's coming up. Just because, I don't know, my ayahuasca experiences have been probably some of the most profound, and just the setting that it's in. But there is something in me that's I wonder if there was more of a little of the hands-on approach. And I also understand why there's a reluctance to it, because it could be more messy, because it brings the human element. So if there's your bag, you bring your baggage. And I think that's why in something like ayahuasca, it's very let the medicine do the work. I'm just going to sit here and kind of sing the songs and guide the person in this kind of gentle but standing back way. But there isn't the relational aspect so much. And I always imagine what would the future be of taking these ancient medicines and these ancient practices and then actually integrating it with what we're learning now and what we're developing now.
Yeah, that would be amazing. So, I mean, as wonderful and as powerful as, that ayahuasca container is for people's process. And, there's nothing that I want to say that takes away from that at all. And I want to be super clear on that. I'm not taking away from the power and usefulness of transpersonal experiences. I will suggest that the container, imagine how, sometimes people get into loops. Sometimes people sort of get into sort of these processes that if there was some kind of human individual attention, that it could be super useful in that space, right? So a question that I ask students is that, just because you're taking a psychedelic, will the profound defense mechanisms that you've had to deal with the things you've experienced, will your defense mechanisms automatically go away just because you took a psychedelic? No, that's a rhetorical question. The answer is no. Like if you have, a level of a personality defense mechanism against the pain in your life, will that personality disorder go away because somebody has taken a psychedelic? Absolutely not. And in fact, I would suggest that the psychological process could sublimate, could corrupt the psychedelic process. If somebody has narcissistic wounding, right, where at their core they just don't feel good enough, and they're constantly compensating for it, what's a psychedelic going to be like in that person's system?
It's going to make it worse. That's what I've found in my research, and just it seems that I'm actually really curious about that. Like, is there a way to resolve something like NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, with a psychedelic psychotherapy? Because it does seem like just taking psychedelics, and you take it and you have this experience, and then you have this God experience, and you come back and then you're like, oh, I'm God.
I'm God.
Yeah.
Yeah. Clearly my lesson is that I'm God and I'm the only person that exists. Yeah. And if anybody wants like a really vivid example of this, I mean, just imagine what would happen if Trump took a psychedelic.
I'm super curious about that. I'm super curious about that.
I think I will say that, so in the mental health world, something that used to be called an access to diagnosis. What we're talking about is personality disorder. And it means that the wounding that this person had is so core to who they are that really it's at the level of their personality, and it's not going to change, right? And so really the traditional world of mental health hasn't had much, if anything, to offer people with those types of diagnoses. They have like self-regulation and management tools that are helpful, but they're not resolution. They're not, healing. So things like DBT are designed for that. But I think some of the incredible beauty of something like a psychedelic is that it absolutely can work at the level of personality. I think again, it has to be quite directed to do that. It has to be focused, and there has to be a really powerful, strong container for somebody with that to go into that process. Because I mean, if you think about it, what we see happen as somebody unfurls their personality defense is like a nuclear bomb level of reactivity that goes off in a person's system. So the container really has to be able to hold that. And we got into this conversation because, I'd mentioned, what if Trump took a psychedelic? So if he took a psychedelic and if he was by himself, his narcissism would absolutely mop the floor with that psychedelic process, right? It wouldn't be challenged at all. Versus if he was in a psychotherapeutic container and you had, a therapist kind of also working along with the psychedelic to sort of challenge the personality disorder, I think that could look very different for people.
Yeah, that would be I would pay to see that. I would pay to see a psychedelic psychotherapy session with Donald Trump. I would pay for that.
That's a new pay-per-view.
Yeah. So I'm also curious about, like, what are some of the hubristic traps that a therapist or healer can fall into working with psychedelic medicines? And some of, like, you are talking about it's an art form, and like, what are like the things that can kind of go wrong in this process if somebody's not well trained?
Oh God. Well, boy, what couldn't go wrong in this process?
Yeah, that would have been a better question.
God. So one thing I think that's nice about it, this is sort of a preliminary answer to that, is that uh, a, a participant's system is intelligent, right? And so I think it will make an assessment of what a particular container can hold and what it can't hold. So I think a person's system will suppress, oftentimes it will suppress material that it knows that, this is not the right space for this to come out. This is ceremony space. This is not, a psychotherapeutic container. And so I think there could be this natural self-regulation that happens for people that when they're aware of that. But let's see. And are you asking what could go wrong in terms of the client process, or what could go wrong in terms of like what are the pitfalls that therapists could fall into?
Yeah, the latter, like the pitfalls, like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, this is something that I'll just confess to that I experienced early on in my career with this is, there's narcissistic benefits to being a psychedelic therapist. There absolutely are. I mean, let me set this up for you, right? Let's say you're working with somebody and this person their system's been locked down for their entire lives. They've never really opened themselves or experienced love or something like that. And you're doing, a medicine session with them. Doesn't matter what it is. But let's say for the first time in their life, they start to experience the goodness of the world and love and, you as a loving presence, right? They're seeing you through those eyes. And, this might not happen the first time this experience happens to you, but let's say this just keeps happening to you, right? Like you're in the psychedelic space and people are really opening up and they're tender and they're vulnerable and they're having experiences that they've never had before. At some point, there's going to be something in the therapist that says, I'm the magic here.
Yeah.
Right. There's something special about me that's really kind of creating this. And so this is a case in which, if the therapist is coming to the table with their own narcissistic wounds, with their own sort of sense of badness and their own not okay place, their therapy practice, their psychedelic practice can absolutely be a way to get their own unmet needs fed by this.
Wow. Yeah. That's definitely a pitfall to look for, and just makes me think about there's I can see how there's so many. I see it for myself, like just to like there is a desire, like I can see how there would be a desire or find this work super meaningful to hold a ceremony, to hold a psychotherapy session with psychedelics for somebody, and to see that like somebody that has never had this kind of experience have this kind of breakthrough experience. And I can see how that would impact somebody and give them a lot of meaning. And it's like how you really have to do a lot of work on yourself to kind of remove yourself from the process of like, yes, this is a beautiful process. And I'm so grateful and thankful to be able to be a part of it and to witness it, but not to take it personally, and also not to get addicted to it of like, oh, I want people to go deep. I want people to have a breakthrough. I need more and more. I want to heal the whole world kind of thing.
Yeah. Oh my God. You're so pointing to it, right? Like, I need you to have a breakthrough is a great, because it means something about me if you don't have a breakthrough. So yeah, not to take it personally, right? Like really get your needs met outside of your role as a psychedelic therapist. If you have unmet needs from childhood, like, my heart goes out to you. You're welcome to the human boat. You are one of us, right? And so, but go do your work with that. Go, you be a client in this work and get those needs met. And when that's kind of healed up, then move into the psychedelic space as a practitioner. Yeah, absolutely. The other place I would suggest people looking in terms of what could go wrong is attachment, right? A lot of times clients, especially those working their individual wounding process, will be working their insecure attachment patterns with you. And if you as a therapist still have your own insecure attachment, you're not okay with that kind of deep connection, or it just like, charges you up or something like that, then I think that's a piece that's super necessary for people to get done. Because it's going to be glaringly obvious in the session if that's not available. If your system's like, no, this is not okay to go to in terms of our connection because this is not work that I've done. Yeah, it's problematic.
Yeah, like this really makes me think about, like you've kind of expressed reverence for the ceremonial space and plant medicines and just psychedelics in general. And I feel like that, and my experiences in those settings have been profoundly positive. But there is a lot of stories and stuff that you hear about things really going wrong and a lot of pathological stuff. And I've heard a lot of stuff about ayahuasca shamans that's not pretty. And there is also this kind of thing in the psychedelic spaces that you would hear is like, oh, one session is 10 years of psychotherapy, right? And it's kind of like psychotherapy is kind of looked down upon, which kind of makes sense with a lot of these modalities that are like overly cognitive. As you've already spoke about, there's these limitations, but there is a lot of this work that is very necessary. And if it's bypassed and you just go and you drink ayahuasca and you do all these psychedelics, and then you're like, oh, this is the way, I don't need to actually have the relational model. I don't need to do the psychotherapeutic work. That's kind of a waste. Psychedelics takes care of it. I think that's where the pathology comes from. And that's where you have the ayahuasca shaman that's had an immense amount of this work with ayahuasca. And, they've probably seen a lot of profound things and had a lot of profound experiences. Yet there's something at the core human level that's not resolved that ends up being a pathology during their work with other people. And it just seems like there's a key piece that's being missed. And how do we integrate? Like, let's integrate the psychotherapeutic stuff with the ceremonial psychedelic, like ancient practices.
Yeah, beautifully said. I think it's I think it's going to be super useful to have reverence for both. To have reverence for processes that are distinctly human and relational, and then reverence for transpersonal process. And there absolutely is overlap as you're right. Yes. Like one will affect the other. That's a great. As you were describing the shaman with the human flaw, I was just thinking about a lens or a mirror that has a flaw in it, right? And it's like, oh, okay, so he's something to discern.
Yeah. So there is a story that you share on your site about an event that led you to forfeit your license to practice therapy in the state of Colorado. And I think this is an important cautionary tale for healing professionals to hear. Would you mind sharing the story with us?
Yeah, I can talk about that. And if anybody wants to, it's out on on the PSI website. So basically, it was an acquaintance of mine, and this person was going through pretty significant depression, and they had been doing it for almost their entire adult life, and at different times. They were heavily medicated, and so I got contacted from this person because their latest rounds of medication just really stopped working for them, and so this person, because I was involved in the MAPS trial, this person wanted to come talk to me about being about psychedelic therapy. And so we talked, and it really was not clear to me that this person's symptoms are coming from trauma, right? You can have depression that comes from a thousand different roads that lead to people being seriously, significantly depressed. And so, we met, and, what I saw was, person that was really struggling. And so we talked about it, and I sent him some links to sign up for the trial if he thought like he wanted to. But in the back of my head, I knew like, okay, this is probably this is not somebody that would be accepted into a trial for PTSD. And then, maybe a few weeks later, I got contacted by this person who wanted to talk to me about doing his own underground work with me. And And initially I said no. And then as the months went on, I just kept hearing from him, and progressively it kept going downhill. And I agreed to meet with him one more time. And what I saw just gave me pause. It was just like, like this person had significantly degraded from their functioning that they had when I initially knew them or saw them the first time. And they were using psilocybin, they were using other medicines just to try and self-medicate in the like kind of a Hail Mary that hopefully something will work, right? And so I became really concerned that this person's gonna like taking a dive into the depths of their mind while they're depressed all by themselves. So I agreed to, sit for them based on that. And so, we were sort of going through it, and this person was using their choice of medicine. And I'll save you more details, but long story short, a few months later, it didn't work. Right. And I think part of my blind spot with this, my hubris with this, was that I had the experience, something like MDMA working for everybody most of the time, and through the MAPS trial, and the fact that the things that this person was taking didn't work was kind of a shock to me. And when they fully came to the conclusion that this wasn't working, this was this person's last chance. And so this was happening, and then they experienced sort of a personal crisis in their relationship. And so this person took their own life. Right. And so I will tell you that this destroyed me. Absolutely. Just, not to even speaking of sort of the career consequences and things like that, which I feel like I have come back from, but just personally, emotionally, I think anybody that's deeply involved with somebody and trying to save somebody, like what that's like for them when that person says, okay, I'm calling it quits, right? So, at this point, the way that I hold it now is that, that's a right of all of ours. If we are looking at life and we're choosing to not be here, that's an adult making an adult decision. And so at this point, I can respect that. But at the same time, it's just, I would say if you are a psychedelic therapist or a practitioner, and that, I would say, you are taking someone on when you say yes to them, to have them come in to work with you. You're taking on their energy, you're taking on, lots for them. So I will say, for me personally, it took me years to come out from underneath a rock, from this one. And thankfully I did. And it was through my own medicine work that I was able to. But yeah, there was a lot of PTSD for me around it. There was I found at times, like in my dreams, like I would be taking on this person's process because they had kind of dropped it abruptly in the middle, I would say. So, there's all sorts of things that happen when in that scenario.
Yeah, that's a very moving tale, and you didn't mention the part about you forfeiting your license.
Oh yeah, mm-hmm.
Yeah, that element also, because
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So I think one of the things that happens in a community of people when somebody exits, right, when somebody commits suicide, is they look for meaning. And part of people do not want to live in a world where, people who are successful and should have happy lives commit suicide. Right. And so I think people look for meaning in that case. And also I think people look for, somebody to blame. Yeah, exactly. So, and it wasn't just me. There was a community of people around this person that was kind of working with them, sitting with them, people who had licensed as doctors, Another therapist was involved with this. So altogether, when this happened and things blew up, there was some person in their community that I think didn't quite have access to all the information of what was going on, but they grieved both myself and the other therapist that was involved in this. And at the time, I mean, if this is something that would happen now, this would have played out very differently. At the time, I was pretty convinced that, this is harm reduction. This is just, making sure a person doesn't kill themselves by launching themselves into outer space with their own psychedelic experiences while being very depressed. But at the time when this was happening, I was in the MAPS trial, and I was terrified that, because there's precedence for this. This has happened in the past where psychedelic research gets derailed because of a problem with one of the researchers. So when I got grieved around this event, I didn't say a word. I didn't put up a struggle. I didn't contest it or anything like that. I was like, my personal license is not worth potentially derailing something like MDMA. And so I just forfeited my license without contesting it at all. And I think if this happened now, because, we're much further along in the MDMA trial and I'm not a part of it or anything like that, I would have a very different response. So yeah, I was completely silent about this for a period of time that I thought the trial was vulnerable.
Yeah, it's very selfless of you and sensitive to what's going on, and it being a sensitive time period for psychedelics, and like any little thing like this, the media just would love to just jump on it and and continue kind of the negative stigma that psychedelics have had for decades. And it's like now we're finally starting to get this research that's showing the potential, and then God forbid a story comes out like this and they just blow it up and you get all this backlash, and we're still kind of struggling. We're still struggling to really make this mainstream, to really make this, easier access. You know what I'm saying? Making it more these treatments legalized and allowing people to use these things like, now ketamine is become, legal in the psychotherapeutic context, but like psilocybin still hasn't in many countries. So, yeah, it's just we are still in the sensitive stage, even though now it is getting better. And that story that is just it's a very moving story, and it's almost like it almost feels like that had to be a part of your process, just like your journey. Like it's just weird. Like it almost like even though it's such a traumatic and difficult situation, it's almost like if anybody was to go through that and get out on the other side, it would be you.
Thank you. That's how I'm seeing it, that this was an essential part of who I am today and my journey. I think if this didn't happen, I would have just continued with MAPS and probably be training people to work with MDMA at this point through MAPS. But because this happened, it really kind of made me take a U-turn or make a left-hand turn. And now we're getting to really develop this work with cannabis, which again, I think the benefit here is that cannabis is not an FDA approved or controlled substance. I see it as the people's psychedelic. It's incredibly inexpensive. It's widely available. And we can do amazing kinds of work with it. So in a horrible way, like, thank you that this this happened.
Yeah. So I want to share this a little bit because it's kind of relevant. My wife is actually a therapist. She has a psychotherapy practice, clinicians with a bunch of clinicians working with her, and I'm working with her now. So interacting a lot with clinicians. I'm interacting a lot with different modalities and learning. And I think that's part of my job, is to kind of learn all of these new modalities and therapeutic approaches and stay on the cutting edge of mental health, what's new. And psychedelics, there's nothing like psychedelics. That's I just seen what it's done for my mental health, for my life, for my understanding of myself and reality. And Yeah, I'm very interested in potentially like bringing these modalities and these experiences to more therapists, to more people working in the mental health space. Yeah, so the trainings that you do, this I kind of wanted to ask a little bit more. From my understanding, they do provide continued education courses. They are accredited, the training that you do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's a national accreditation that we have, so people can get CEUs for taking it.
Yeah, so if there are any therapists, I am going to send this out to the therapists that work in our company so they could listen to this because I think it would be really interesting for them. But if there's any therapists listening, this is a modality that's accredited. And I mean, if you listen to this interview, you kind of see what the power and what's different about this modality than some of the other, therapeutic things that like CBT is very big right now, and that's huge. And I know that's something in our practice. A lot of therapists are trained in that. But there are other modalities and there are other pathways that are needed for dealing with certain things like trauma. And this is one of them. The other question that I did have was since you only take 3 people,
Yeah.
how many of these trainings do you do? How many of people do you have working in PSI that are doing these? How often are you doing them? And how vigorous are you and who gets let in? Like, because it seems like since you have such a small group that I'm curious about that.
It's pretty important who we let in. I know. So we interview every single person that gets into the training. They have an application process and then we interview them. The interesting thing about that, Artem, is that, again, I think what most people that do this training, they've been therapists for 15, 20, 25 years even. So they are very well processed at what I would call a secondary consciousness level, right? They're very functional people and they know their stuff inside and out, right? However, what they don't know is how this lives in their primary consciousness, meaning how this lives in their body. And what we often find when we go in with folks is somebody who's really well compartmentalized, right? And they're functional because of how well compartmentalized they are. This is not that, right? The psychedelic process mixed with the somatic process specifically goes in and wrecks people's compartmentalization. It wrecks their coping mechanisms, the crutches that their system has used to sort of be functional. All of that starts to go away. So even people that are therapists and highly functional will start to feel a whole lot of their symptoms, a whole lot of these unresolved things until, so they're becoming more associated to what this actually was like before they get to the other side of resolution versus more compartmentalization or symptom management. So I will just say that is a completely normal thing for people to have in our trainings. But the question that you asked in terms of how many we're running and things like that. So right now, we have 4 instructors that are, including myself, that are certified to provide this training. Mostly Denver is our hub of trainings in the US. But we do a fair amount of international trainings as well in Europe, Australia, and Canada. And so in 2023, we're going to be running 3 trainings a month in Denver. And which, I will say, even when you look at that number, 3 trainings, great, we're expanding. It's still tiny, right? It's still like 3 trainings a month means 9 people for that month. And again, I will just say that we've tried it other ways. It doesn't work to try and communicate this through a different pathway. Like people have to have the experience of it for them to become really, competent somatic psychedelic therapists.
Yeah. So somebody coming to a training like this, they're having the cannabis experience, they're having the ketamine experience. Are they also having the psilocybin experience? How is that? What is like for sure you're going to have this experience, or you got to be willing to use these certain substances?
Yeah. So we do fully legal trainings, which mean that we only work with legal medicines in the context of where we are. So in the US, that means we work with cannabis and, prescribed ketamine. We have run trainings in Amsterdam. Yeah. And so we could and at some point we really will begin to focus more on bringing psilocybin into the trainings. But what I would say about this is truly a non-medicine specific training, meaning this is not a ketamine training. This is not an MDMA training. It's a psychotherapy. It's a somatic trauma training to be used with altered states of consciousness that get created by psychedelics. So the one of the real, I think, benefits of working with both cannabis and ketamine, not only in the training, but in a person's private practice, is that these are 2-hour discrete experiences, right? Versus MDMA, which is an entire day experience. It's a powerful day, but you're in there for the entire day. And, psilocybin, a 6-hour experience at a minimum, really. And so I think these medicines fit more nicely into a private practice setting. And the other beauty of that is that if, let's say you do a session on Monday with cannabis or ketamine and you ended in mid-process, you ended in a kind of a gnarly place, you don't have to wait till next week or next month to go back in. They can come back the very next day and go right in and pick up where they left off. So I think that's you can titrate these medicines and as little or as much as the client needs, based on what's happening in their process, rather than based on the limitations of, how often you can work with these medicines.
Yeah. So I think what I'm also hearing you say is that this process and this modality would be helpful to learn for any psychotherapist, even if they're not working with actually administering psychedelics. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Again, we used to teach this process completely independently of psychedelics. I mean, I think it would be a little bit of a missed opportunity if somebody took our training and chose to not work with psychedelics, because that's how the training really is geared at this point. But certainly you don't have to, right? Yeah. And people really get to choose.
Yeah. So this is my kind of strong opinion and my own experience, and maybe you resonate with this too, but would you say this? I kind of feel like if you are this seasoned psychotherapist and you see with some of them, they're seasoned psychotherapists, they understand a lot about psychology, they understand how to relate with people, they understand how to do therapy, but they've never had a psychedelic experience. My take is that actually psychedelics done in the right context would benefit that person greatly in understanding how to work with people, in understanding how the mind works, perhaps in such ways that even this insane amount of, not to discount the training, but in ways that are just unbelievable. I think it was, Timothy Leary that, he was also a trained psychologist, that he just said like, oh, I've learned all these things for 10, 20 years, all this psychology. And then I have this one experience with mushrooms and I'm just like, wow, this is something nobody could have taught me. So my take is that a therapist, if they integrated and had these experiences, they would potentially become a better therapist. Would you agree with that? Do you think that is something that can benefit a therapist in understanding the mind and understanding how people work, and just on a deeper level, and understanding themselves on a deeper level?
Yeah, there's no doubt. Even if somebody wasn't going to work with psychedelics, I think a therapist investigating their own mind, like really making contact with their programming and the material that lives down there, is going to be incredibly useful for them. And I mean, this is what we're trying to do. This is what the really the classic modalities like psychoanalysis and psychodynamic trainings, they would say to people, like, you have to have 150 hours of your own analysis before we unleash you onto the general public here. And so that's where they're coming from, that like you knowing you being well processed, knowing your own system is going to serve you immensely, even if you choose to never work with psychedelics. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And that's where I kind of see your training. It's just from both angles. It's like you get to learn the actual modality, the psychotherapeutic modality, and then you also get to have the psychedelic experience for some people that haven't had it. And you get to have it in this kind of very safe context with somebody that's so trained to do it. So it's probably going to be very positive, even if it's very difficult. Yeah, it's beautiful that you're doing this training, and I'm not a therapist, but who knows, maybe one day I'll be able to do this training or be able to
Uh-huh.
do it. And this is definitely something that I'm going to be pushing and recommending for the clinicians that I'm working with. And this is just something I recommend, like just to be able to learn this modality and to have this psychedelic experience. Both of them is just, I don't know, it's just a game changer, I think.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Artem. Yeah, I really appreciate that. We're really trying to hold to the integrity of this training. And again, we're not going to set the world on fire by training 3 people at a time. But if, my allegiance is to the art form that
Yeah.
this is. And I don't care about the rest of it. It's like, this is how we can do it. One thing, if I may,
Yeah, please.
something that we haven't touched on that I think is an incredible part of psychedelic therapy. It's an incredible opportunity in psychedelic therapy that I think gets not just missed by, the transpersonal containers, but also the world of psychotherapy pretty much leaves this out. And what I'm referring to is traumatic transference, right? So, if I may sort
Yeah,
of.
please expand on that. Please expand on that.
So basically, let me give you 2 scenarios here. When somebody could have a trauma where they get hit by a drunk driver, let's say, right? And so in that experience, you don't know the other person. You don't have a relationship with the other person. It's a one-time event. There was a before the event, life before the event, and then there's life after the event. And certainly people can have profound trauma from a single event thing like a car accident. Now, contrast that to somebody whose trauma comes from being their family of origin, right? So basically, their trauma comes from being abused or neglected by parents, right? So this is something that happens repeatedly. It happens when you're in a very developmentally young, sensitive window in your life, developmentally sensitive period in your life. And in that case, the very definition of family, right? The very definition of mother, of father, of intimacy, of touch, like all of those things are tainted with the trauma, right there. And in fact, those relationships are an essential part of the traumatic memory. So again, contrast that with the first scenario. Relationship is not a part of that trauma. You don't know this person. You're not going to know them after the event, really, right? And versus the second scenario, oh, you have deep intimacy with the people that were, part of this trauma in your system, right? So you as a child, your listeners are not going to want to hear this, but you as a child have absolutely internalized your parents. Your parents live inside of you, even if you hated them, even if you wanted nothing to do with them, they formed you,
Yep.
right? And so what we find is that when you're working with trauma from a single event, it's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward, right? But when you're working with trauma from a relationship that happened, there's an enormous amount of what the field calls transference in that, because again, the relationship got encoded in as part of the traumatic memory, right? So what this means is that when somebody is going in and they're working with these childhood experiences of abuse or neglect, if you start asking questions about, how they see you, like they're in a psychedelic space. And if the therapist begins to ask, like, so how are you seeing me right now? Right? Or how do you think I feel about you right now? It's going to open the floodgates to like how much they are transferring their parent on to you in that moment. So really, let me just give a quick definition of transference is basically when you take the complex, incomplete, problematic emotions and experiences that you've had in your past relationships and project them onto people in your current life, right? And we all do this. This is the foundation of psychoanalytic, psychodynamic therapy to working with transference like this, right? So And I think a good understanding of why we do this is like, we're looking for solutions. We're looking for mastery, right? The whole idea here is that, this relationship crushed me in the past. There's some part of me that didn't make it out of my childhood. And so the system at this point says, okay, let's do this dance again. And hopefully you'll fail, we can come through it better this time. Right. So, if you've ever been in a relationship, we are completely replaying your family of origin patterns. Your partner is replaying, their family of origin patterns, which is basically every relationship. Right. So that's what's happening there. Now, when you supercharge that with, a psychedelic process and you're going in through the body, what we'll see is that, people like just making eye contact with you while they're in the psychedelic space, their vision is going to distort you. They're going to see you in completely different ways. They're going to see you as somebody that might hurt them. They're going to see you as somebody that doesn't care about them. They're going to see you as somebody who is, in it for all the wrong reasons, or is going to manipulate them, or, just whatever they experience from their family, they're going to start projecting onto you, right? And this doesn't happen unless the therapist begins to really invite it to happen. But I will tell you, it's an enormous amount of charge. There's an enormous therapeutic opportunity here when you do open the door to this level of projection that the client can have with you.
Yeah, that was very insightful. And it's funny because right before you said this, the question I was going to ask you is there anything you wish that I would have asked you that I didn't, or is there anything else you would like to share before we wrap up? So I just thought that was interesting. And that question still stands. If there is anything else you want to mention or bring up that you feel we didn't discuss that you think would be an important piece to add.
No, that was it. And I just want to, I think mentioning that is really an important piece because it's there, right? And nobody who goes through training with CBT does any kind of training around working with transference. And it's a really specific skill set to learn to be able to work at that level. So I'm happy to sort of, having that being one of the contributions that our training has to the psychedelic community here. And outside of that, let me just say thank you. This has been wonderful. This has been such an easy, relaxed conversation, and I feel like we're very much in a similar wavelength here when talking about this. So yeah, thank you very much, Artem.
Yes, Saj, really appreciate you coming on. And I felt like this was very insightful. I'm looking forward to listening to this again and sharing it with all the clinicians at my wife's practice. And I guess, maybe you could plug this, what is it, where people could reach you. I'm going to put all the links in the show note too, but you could just kind of state it here also.
Absolutely. So if you go to the PSI website, which is Psychedelic Somatic.org. You can reach our enrollment director if you have questions about the training. You can just reach out and touch base with us there. We have a lot of great information on that website.
Great site, yeah.
Yeah, so if you go to the video section, we have there's an hour and 10-minute training excerpt that we have from one of our trainings that describes a nervous system map that we teach every single student, and pretty much all of our clients that I've ever worked with gets a version of that map. And so whether you work with this modality or not, whether you work with psychedelics or not, I think that's a super helpful video that's on that videos page. And the other thing that I could recommend is if you're interested in really the anatomy of working what this transference piece looks like, there is a podcast. I hope you don't mind if I...
Oh, no.
Okay.
Nice. Please do.
There's a podcast, another podcast that I did with Craig Heacock on his show, Back from the Abyss, that is on our homepage of the PSI website. You can find it there. And really what we do is we go through a ketamine assisted psychotherapy session where we're doing sustained eye contact. And this person has enormous amounts of negative transference coming out towards me, thinking that I'm going to attack her, feeling terrified of me. So I think it's, we play like 5 minutes of the session, and then we discuss what happens afterwards. So I think that's one of the best teaching tools that I have right now in terms of the transference piece.
Yeah, I'll definitely link it in the show notes to that podcast. And yeah, the videos you have are incredible. I think that's worth mentioning also, that I haven't really seen that many high quality videos of the actual therapeutic process that you provide. And I think like even the webinar, when I saw, that's what the piece you do about automatic nervous system, like that's great too. Like everything that you have about that is worth checking out. It's very interesting. That's actually one of the things we didn't talk about, but there's just so much moving pieces that we can't cover everything. But we'll definitely link it to your site so people can dive deeper if they're interested in it. And Saj, really just appreciate the work you're doing. I think it's powerful. I think it's important. I appreciate that you're focusing on quality over quantity and just really giving reverence to the psychotherapeutic space and psychedelics in general. So thanks so much for what you do, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Artem. This has been great.